instead of Taiwan. We have the great pleasure of welcoming here today Peter MacIntyre. Apologies for the late start. Apparently our technical system does not play sounds from Cape Breton. It only plays sounds from Ottawa. But without further ado, I'd like to invite Richard Clément, who is the former director of the Official Language and Bilingualism Institute, and who is a longtime collaborator and friend of Peter MacIntyre, to introduce Peter.
It's a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Peter MacIntyre. So Peter was born in Glaze Bay, Nova Scotia. That's an important factor you should know about him. He studied as an undergraduate at UCCB, University College of Cape Breton, now Cape Breton University, and went down to do his PhD at the University of Western Ontario with Bob Gardner. Subsequent to that, who was also my own advisor, and subsequent to that, we were happy to welcome him on campus. He was with us in 1992, 1994 for 2 years, during which the lab flourished, and we mostly had a lot of fun recreating the lab as a version of Star Trek. And I will not go on to discuss this. Peter's career in terms of interest has evolved greatly through the years. He started with an interest in anxiety, which was relatively local, and then developed more and more ambitious models of linguistic behavior. And those included, to start with, willingness to communicate. And if you've read that paper, it encompasses a number of factors. He also started dealing with the issue of, and we will be talking about that today, no positive psychology today? No. We also kept dealing with positive psychology, and also it's a testimony to his interest in teaching, because it also developed an independent online course, open online course on positive psychology, and that is also a great contribution to teaching. He's also extremely competent and, how should I say, he produced a lot of courses, constructed a lot of courses. Sorry, sometimes my English does not kick in at the right time. Anyway, that's something to study. He has been mostly interested lately in complex system theory and how to deal with complex system theory using an idiodynamic approach. And when a few years ago Peter started talking about an idiodynamic approach, as I recall, it was simply one experiment. He said, why don't we do this, that, and that? And then we talked, and it became evident that this was a whole approach, an whole new way of looking at the way the language learner behaves within language situations. And so I believe this will be the topic of the talk today. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Richard. As you can see, we're going to talk about three main topics today: willingness to communicate, language anxiety, and perceived competence. And we're going to take a dynamic systems approach to it. And I know that this is an eclectic group, and you have a number of different interests and specialties, and some of you maybe language teachers, some of you psychology, some of you I know it's a diverse group, so I'm going to try and say something that's interesting for all of you, or hopefully. But before I do, as Richard said, not everything works here the way it does in Cape Breton. So I need to show you where it is. Right? This is where I came from yesterday. It's +8 and raining. So Cape Breton University is located there in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And if you have a chance to come to Cape Breton, it's a beautiful place. And I would like to thank you for inviting me today to Ottawa, to come back and visit with all the folks here. But also I'd like to give you an invitation as well, because next summer I'm organizing a conference on the psychology of language learning in Cape Breton between June 24 and 28. And one of our invited speakers will be Richard Clément, who will be giving a plenary address at the conference. So you're welcome to come. This is your invitation. Please do come and join us in Cape Breton, late June. Perfect time of year to visit. It's before all the tourists and the cruise ships show up. So there's still lots to enjoy. All right, so today we're going to talk about three prominent concepts in the individual differences tradition within second language acquisition. So anxiety, competence, and willingness to communicate. But we'll take a complex dynamic systems approach to it. I'll be talking a little bit about the methods that we're using, and I'm hoping our discussion might turn to some of the teaching issues to which this can be applied as well, because I think there's a lot of underexplored territory to examine there. So what this might mean for teaching, what it might mean for research, that would be the topic for today. So to get back to kind of the beginning, as Ishak said, my first research studies were in the field of language anxiety. And one of the very first papers I read when I got to graduate school was Thomas Scoville's 1978 review of the language anxiety literature. I had come from a background in psychology and communication. That was my undergraduate. And so applying this to second language seemed quite natural and an easy transition. So moving from communication apprehension in the native language to language anxiety in the second language was quite good. Now Scoville's review pointed to what he called mixed and confusing results. And he tried to resolve that by saying, well, maybe there's some facilitating forms of anxiety that are good for learning and other debilitating forms of anxiety that are bad for learning. And it really is not an effective way of resolving the problem. And we could do a whole 2-day forum on why facilitating and debilitating was a bad choice. But I think, suffice it to say, I think the field has moved on to say, no, anxiety is bad, motivation, excitement, energy, enjoyment, those are the good things. And if you're getting facilitating effects, it's from those coming along with the anxiety rather than the anxiety itself. So let's keep anxiety as a bad thing that's harmful to performance, and enjoyment or interest or enthusiasm as the good side. And that way we can keep the distinction a little bit crisper than it was back in the late 70s. But the other problem that Scoville had was he was reviewing studies that had a lot of different anxiety measures. Things like test anxiety, something called manifest anxiety, which is a kind of a generalized anxiety disorder. So these really very different sorts of concepts, anxiety concepts, applied to language, and some worked and some didn't, and some were appropriate and some weren't, and that was the problem. That was the heart of the problem. By the mid-1980s, folks like Bob Gardner, Elaine Horowitz, were defining a specific concept of language anxiety that was unique. There's something different about language that creates anxiety. That's what language anxiety is. So instead of anxiety transferred from another domain, let's look at anxiety in language and language use. And that worked extremely well. Research was very productive in this field. It's one of it's really the only emotion that's been studied in any detail. And we can now come to conclusions. There's a meta-analysis that's either come out or is recently, or is going to come out soon, that shows the typical correlation between language anxiety and course grades is somewhere between -0.3 and -0.4. So in individual differences, that's a meaningful and noticeable correlation. What's the correlation between anxiety and willingness to communicate? Typically -0.4 to -0.6. So if you're anxious, you tend to communicate less, you're less willing to communicate, you don't take chances in the language. Really solid results have been replicated many times. Does the correlation between language anxiety and specific skill areas differ? The answer there generally is yes. If you're very apprehensive about writing and someone gives you writing tasks, that's going to be worse than if they give you a reading task. Right? So it all makes good sense. It's a nice picture here. And the key implication has been, if we can lower anxiety, we should see an improvement in language skills, communication, course grades, and so on. Language anxiety research going very well. Perceived competence, similarly, is going very well. Usually there's a very strong relationship between measures of language competence and the perception of one's own language competence. And I know, Richard, you've done some studies in this area as well. There's been development of standardized testing to measure competence, and you've seen the Common European Framework of Reference for languages, right? So grades people, and then you move up from level to level, and so it's a nice way of representing communication competence in languages. Now, some might argue that the perception of competence may be more relevant to communication than actual competence itself. And one of the studies we did when I was here as a postdoc showed that anxious students tend to underestimate their own competence, and relaxed, confident students overestimate their competence, as judged by a knowledgeable L2 speaker. So if you're thinking you're better than you are and you're jumping into conversations all the time, that's where you're going to talk in order to learn. And so it may be that the confident people are actually developing confidence more rapidly because they're energizing their communication skills, whereas the anxious students are holding themselves back and not progressing quite as quickly. So, perceived competence research going very well. Willingness to communicate defines the probability that one will choose to initiate communication given the opportunity. It was defined originally in the communication literature as a trait, so a stable pattern. Some people talk more than others. You know them. You've been to meetings with them. Some people don't stop talking. Other people, it's very difficult to get them to start talking. That's willingness to communicate. And it's highly correlated with both anxiety and perceived competence in both the second language and the native language. And choosing to communicate or not may be one of the most important decisions or traits that a person can carry with them as they try and become a second language speaker. So it affects the ability to talk in order to learn. There are cultural differences that come into play. And patterns of intergroup contact are extremely relevant to how willing people are to communicate or to avoid communication. So we created what we call the pyramid model. I'll show it to you in a moment. There's 6 layers. It's organized by time. So at the bottom here are long-term, stable, enduring influences that don't change. The intergroup climate is something you're born into. Some would argue with the heritability of personality. About half your personality is inherited. So if you like, your personality exists even before you do. So these are long-term, very stable sort of processes. And as you move up, you get to short-term, transient, situated sort of processes. So we define willingness to communicate as a behavioral intention, arising in a situation. So if you look to the level down here, boxes 3 and 4, you want to say something to somebody, and you believe you have the competence to do so. You have state confidence. So your anxiety is not interfering, you have the ability to say something, you want to say it to a specific person at a specific time, and that creates the intention to communicate at a particular moment. And we call this crossing the Rubicon. So you create the sense that, yes, I'm willing to communicate, and then you jump in. It's a little bit like, oh no, what happened there? Oh, I had a nice little slide here of a parachute jumper. Oh, shoot. Okay. Anyway, it's gotten out of order, I guess. So the idea is, a parachute jumper is in a perfectly good aircraft and decides to leave for some reason. Right? So this aircraft is going to land safely, but no, I'd rather have a piece of cloth get me to the ground. And for a lot of L2 speakers, that's what they face. It's like, do I start a conversation? I don't know where it's going. I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know what the demands are going to be. I might really embarrass myself. So that jumping, that crossing Rubicon into willingness to communicate is the moment in time that we were very interested in talking about. So as we did our research, we were using the trait-like willingness to communicate from the communication literature. So we found things like immersion students were more willing than traditional French as a second language students. If you have friends who are willing to communicate, it makes you more willing to communicate. If you're willing, if the social context provides more choice, that increases willingness because you can choose or not to. It affects, Yashima found that Japanese sojourners coming to the United States were the ones who were more willing to communicate benefited more from the trip abroad. It predicts the initiation of communication in both native and second languages. It's correlated with personality just about exactly as you would expect. But there are occasions when you can make an introvert more willing than an extrovert by having a lot of routine, right? The same thing over and over again. That's what introverts really like. They like routine, predictability, things that don't change very much. Extroverts love change. They love the new. So you can make something very routine, introverts are going to like that. And now there are several measures of trait-like willingness to communicate available. We're doing a little annotated bibliography. We're going to put it up on ResearchGate, so if you're interested in what these actually are, that'll be available soon. So, life was good. Language anxiety research, going well. Perceived competence research, going well. Willingness going well, everything was good, life was good. So then, we noticed there's a wee bit of a disconnect here between that pyramid model that we were using as our conceptual foundation and the way we were measuring willingness to communicate. It's kind of like we were talking about a stopwatch by measuring it with a calendar. Right? So we were looking at long-term processes while we wanted to talk about short-term ones. So we were looking at traits when we were kind of talking more about states of mind. And if you look at the willingness to communicate measured, there's our pyramid. I don't know why I did that transition. And there's the measure. So here's a moment in time where you can communicate with someone because you have something to say and you want to say it. But the questionnaire says, here's 20 situations in which you might communicate. What percentage of time do you think you'd be willing? So of all the times you communicated while standing in line with an acquaintance or presenting a talk to a group of strangers, of all those times, what percentage were you willing to do it? It's like, this is kind of a lifetime. It's a long-term measure, whereas we were looking at kind of the short term. And that's the disconnect, is how do you measure this in the short term rather than the long term? Long-term stuff's going great. The short-term measures, that's what we needed. So the focus had to be on this changing conception of time. So rather than looking at language learning as something that begins and ends, kind of like this lecture, right? This lecture has a starting time, an ending time, and then there'll be talking in between. But that's not really how language learning begins. When does language learning actually begin? It's almost impossible to pinpoint a moment at which you started to learn a second language. And maybe it's not even worth trying, because it might be better to think, rather than a start and a finish conception of time, think about how we arrive at different points in time, continuously new moments being created, transitioning out of the old ones. So as we're talking here, I'm looking around in your faces, and if I said something really offensive or insulting, there'd be an immediate change, right? That moment in time would change significantly. And then the communication after that would be a new moment in time. And then after that would be another, and then another, and then another. So if we keep thinking of this as constantly arriving at that point in the pyramid, that top, where you have a chance to communicate, and do you decide to start or just to hold back? That's what we're talking about here. So we needed a conception of time that focused on the now, rather than these longer term enduring influences that we had been focused on. And so we had a study, it was a large scale qualitative study. We were looking at situations in which grades 7 to 9 immersion students in Cape Breton, so these are all Anglophone students learning French, and we gave them a diary for 6 weeks. And we wanted them to talk about the situations that they encountered that week that made them most willing and least willing. And we had probably around 300 diary entries to analyze by the end of it. And we thought, going in, that we'd have a list of situations that we could describe as unwilling, and a different list of situations that were willing, and there'd be a beautiful, noticeable difference between them. And there wasn't. There wasn't. What we got were things like this. This young girl, she was, I think, around 12 years old, said, I was most unwilling to speak French when I was at a craft show with my mom, and she met someone who spoke French. Mom introduced me to her friend, and vice versa. I felt like saying hello in French, really. But I felt I would make a mistake, unwilling. I don't feel comfortable talking with strangers, unwilling. I would, though, if I had another opportunity, willing. It's like, okay, how do we classify this? How do we code this? Is this willing or unwilling? She wrote it in the page called unwilling. Right? So that's where it wound up being coded. But the process going on here is extremely conflicted. She wants to, but she's holding back. It's kind of like skydiving. That's where it is. Right? So you're in a perfectly good aircraft, your native language. Do you jump out into your second language? This young girl, she had the choice, she decided not to. But she wants another chance. And this actually, skydiving has been studied. Back in 1965, Epstein and Fenns did this study of the moments in time before you actually jump out of a perfectly good aircraft. So they were looking at the approach and avoidance motivation the night before, when you get to the airport, when you board the aircraft, when the signal comes on that they're ready to open the door, when somebody actually pushes you out the door because it's your first time and you're not going to jump on your own, and then when you land. And you can see here there's graphs for approach motivation, avoidance motivation. It makes good sense. But time comes in again because this changes over time. That's been the real interesting part of this. This graph is for new people jumping out of aircrafts. This graph is for people who've got experience doing it. So if you look at the maximum avoidance, go that first. Maximum avoidance for people who are doing it for the first time is when the ready signal comes on. When the light comes on saying, we're about to open the door. You look like you've done this.
I look like that would be my maximum
Okay.
avoidance.
All right. But once you've done this a number of times, look at where your maximum avoidance is. It's the night before where you're thinking, oh God, I gotta walk the dog. And then I gotta pack this stuff, and then I gotta go to the airport, and then I got the kids to pick up. So your avoidance is not in the aircraft, it changes over time. So even though these are pretty easily defined processes, they alter as time goes by. So new moments are created with experience. So there's 2 points going back to that qualitative study with the immersion kids. One is that the experience at the moment of decision can be quite ambivalent, quite conflicted. Just like as if you're jumping into something and you don't know how it's going to go. And we also learned that the situations that produce high willingness to communicate are not very different from the situations that produce low willingness to communicate. The changes can be very, very subtle. Jean-Marc Dewally and I just had a study a year or two ago on language enjoyment. And again, the young people were talking about what made them enjoy language. And there were kids talking about how their teacher made fun of them in class, and they loved it. Can you imagine how that situation had to be constructed so that the kids would enjoy being made fun of, instead of finding it anxiety-provoking or hostile? How easy it would be to change the situation from happy to angry, right? So what we're talking about is a combination of things that are happening in a given situation that, when you put them together, create a unique experience. And that experience can change very quickly. So here we have a moment in time. You're running along, learning your language quite well. All of a sudden, someone wants me to communicate in French. A wall of anxiety comes up. Do you crash into the wall, or do you find your way around it? And how does this process happen? So this is where we're getting into the need for an approach to look at dynamics, at how things change. What is it that's going on in these situations, and how can we study those in a way that captures the process rather than just the product? So we're looking at a dynamic systems approach, and Diane Larson-Freeman started talking about this maybe 10, 12, 15 years ago, something like that. And she has said herself, she was a voice in the wilderness. Right? She was talking and really didn't find many people listening, and what she was saying was different and quite confusing. There's a language of its own for dynamic systems. So it's been a long time for this to sort of catch on. Just out of curiosity, how many here have read about dynamic systems theory from Diane Larson-Freeman or similar? So a little less than half. I asked this in Montreal, and it was about half the audience. So it's making inroads. There's progress being made in these applications. So what complex dynamic systems is really a meta theory. It's not a theory of anything itself. It's a way to approach theorizing. So it's how to create theory, really focusing on interactions within and between systems. Familiar variables are contextualized within these interacting systems. So anxiety is part of a system. Willingness is part of a system. Perceptions of competence are part of a system. It's an approach that examines process in detail, emphasizing complexity and change. But what I want to emphasize here is at the bottom, it's a different approach to studying the same processes we've been interested in for a long time. We're still interested in anxiety, competence, willingness, motivation, and so on, but this is a nice, really interesting way of capturing that time dimension and really focusing on the processes that occur over time. Now, this is probably a 3-hour lecture all by itself, just to define these terms and make them comprehensible. So if this is something that you've not had experience with, don't worry about this. We're going to kind of gloss over these definitions, but just to kind of give you an orientation to what we're looking at here. The idea of complex isn't complicated. Complex and complicated are different here. Complex means constantly interacting, right? So that young girl talking about her immersion experience, where she had a chance at the craft show to talk. There's a lot of things interacting in that moment. Her mother is there. What impact does her mother have? Her mother's friend. Now, if that had been the little girl's friend, how would things have been different? Right? You've got the atmosphere of a craft show. How did that impact? So all of these different variables are interacting at the same time. And the young girl said she would if she had another opportunity. So change the situation a little bit, and then she might be willing. She felt she might be willing to communicate. So complex means constantly interacting. With dynamic, obviously means changing quickly over time. An open system means that you may not even be able to measure all the things that are interesting at a particular moment. We had one person talk about public speaking anxiety, and she said she would speak anytime to anyone on any topic, except if her mother was there. There's no theory out there that has mother in it. Well, Freud's does. Except for Sigmund Freud, there's nobody who talks about mother as a huge part of their theory of public speaking anxiety. So how do you allow for this in your theorizing and in designing your studies when you don't know what the factors might be for a particular person? So the idea that it's open to external influences you haven't thought about before. Adaptive, that's the central quality of these systems, they adapt. Self-organizing in the sense that they make sense, they're emergent, they're coordinated and meaningful. So if you look at the kid jumping out of the aircraft, you understand what that young fellow is going through. The girl at the craft show, you understand what she's thinking. You can put yourself in that situation, it makes sense. And the various things that we can define in that situation, motivation, competence, anxieties, friendships, all the different parts of that system fit together in a meaningful, coherent way. So that's what self-organizing and emergent refer to. It's creating out of the interaction a meaningful, coordinated whole. So traditional methods often focus on linear analysis, and many of our statistical methods focus on linear analysis. There's a predictable plus error component to things. It's focusing on what is stable, what is long-term. Tends to be criticized as being decontextualized. I'm not so sure, because if you look at the role of theory, that helps to add context. But it's also trying to be generalizable. The goal of many scientific disciplines is to create general laws that describe how things work. So these are generalizable principles. With dynamic systems, you're more interested in the nonlinear, in those sudden changes, in the avalanche, right? In that sudden change that happens that has cascading effects throughout the rest of the system. And that makes it less predictable. So your focus here is on how things change, not how things are the same. It is highly contextualized because you need to be able to describe the context to figure out what's happening. And because it's so contextualized, the goal is not to be generalizable. You're not trying to create general laws that describe the pattern or how anxiety works. What you're trying to do is see how anxiety fits within this larger communication system in this particular context. So this changes our research question. Does language anxiety correlate with course grades? I asked this at a conference. Elaine Horowitz was at the conference. I said, Elaine, does anxiety correlate with course grades? Yes, it does. What's the correlation? Now minus 0.4. Thank you. Nice, easy answer. Are extroverts more willing to communicate? Of course, the correlation is very strong. Does motivation predict proficiency? Yes, it does. There's a ton of research showing. All of those are standard individual difference research questions. But if we're looking at the same processes from a different lens, how do we phrase these dynamically? So what happens to a person as anxiety rises during a test? What happens to vocabulary retrieval? What happens to motivation? What happens to their nonverbals? What happens to all of the different parts of the communication system that we might identify? At the moment of choice, what is an extrovert thinking? And how does that differ from an introvert? And in some of our studies, we've shown extroverts are thinking, hey, this is an opportunity to meet somebody. And introverts are thinking, this is an opportunity to really embarrass myself. What happens with word choice as avoidance motivation rises? So the more you want to avoid talking to someone, does that make vocabulary retrieval and word choice more and more difficult? So you can see that these are all process-oriented questions, whereas the standard questions that we've been investigating are more product-oriented. The other part is that these have answers, and these really don't in the same way. Right? We can give you numbers that describe the correlations and the strength of relationships here. This doesn't do that. The dynamic systems don't do that sort of work. Now, I was going to give you an analogy here, and I don't know if this is going to work. But let's imagine we're trying to talk to someone who's not Canadian and who doesn't know how wonderful curling is. And to describe the sport to them, Americans think that, I don't mean to stereotype, but Americans tend to think curling is a strange sport. So, you have a sheet of ice, you have rings on either side, you've got frozen bullseyes, you've got 4 people on the team, one throws, a couple people sweep, another guy yells at the people for some reason. And so you'd explain it like that. But imagine if you wanted to explain what curling was like by showing them something like this. Cross your fingers.
Yeah, really hard. Yeah, just stick that one, see what happens. Intern. Or is intern better than we're in shape? Doesn't matter. Let's go into the tin. Really hard, rolling left, going across. And the win to remain undefeated. Glenn Howard.
As long as you live good, you'll never see a better shot than that.
So now, doesn't curling seem a little more interesting? Right? Now that you put it in motion, you're starting to study the dynamics of it. You can see the emotion, right? That's on everybody's face. The winning team, the opposing team, the announcers, everybody's just full of this contextualized moment in time. Whereas the photos can help you describe the process, but it doesn't quite do it justice. So, what we're trying to do is move from photographs to motion pictures with these new research questions that focus on time and how processes develop. So I'm just going to skip over a couple of these in the interest of time. We're not alone, by the way, in language and being interested in this. There's lots of other fields. Developmental science, developmental psychology in particular, has been very interested in doing this. And so this is not with reference to language, this is with reference to developmental, changing development of children is what I'm trying to say. So what are you looking at? You're looking at the changing individual. That's your fundamental unit of analysis. Observations before, during, and after a period of change. So it's not a pre-test, post-test kind of thing. It's like constantly observing. There's an elevated density of observations, meaning that one pre-test, one post-test is just not enough observation. You need many, many, many points to really make sense of what's happening in order to describe how the processes are interacting. And that these behaviors have to be analyzed intensively, both qualitatively and quantitatively, with the goal of identifying processes that give rise to developmental change. We could just simply replace communication here, we could replace that with language learning. There's many other things that we could replace this with to say this is a different way of looking at the same processes. So one of the methods that have been developed, and this is the one that we've been working with, is called the ideodynamic method. I actually thought I invented that word, but I didn't. I Googled it, and it turns out there's another researcher that had a different meaning of it altogether. But ideodynamics, the way we're using it, is a focus on individuals rather than groups, and it's looking at communication over a short period of time. Communication events. So what we do is we record speech, some kind of interaction or oral test, something similar. The person watches their own video and using software that we've created, rates anything you're interested in. If you want to measure anxiety, motivation, willingness, perceived competence, approach motivation, you can measure any variable of interest using the software. So you tell the person, we want you to rate your level of blank. And they rate it as the video goes along. And it produces a continuous graph of changes in that variable over time. Then we go back and we show them the video again, we print the graph for them, and we say, look at this, you're really high on willingness to communicate here, what's happening? You're really low, a little later, what's happening there? Can you explain it from your point of view? And then we transcribe everything. So our first study on this was published in 2011, where we had 8 oral interview tasks. So describe what you're wearing. Often the very first thing students learn in a language class to describe articles of clothing. It's the first week. This is not the first week. What's the role of Parliament in the Canadian system of government? Many people find that difficult to answer. Discuss the education system of your home province in some detail. Interpret a painting, count to 100 by tens, order a simple meal, give directions to a local shopping mall, which turned out to be far more difficult than people thought going in. Because, I know what right and left means, but how do you say elevator? How do you say parking lot? There's all kinds of vocabulary that crops up in the middle of your story that you don't anticipate. So what we found over the course of those 8 tasks typically looked like this. So high at the beginning, low with the government question, higher with education, and changes constantly as they went along. In this example, this person was relatively flat until she ran into a wall. Remember that graphic with the car and the wall? Well, she ran into that wall. She was trying to figure out how to say 80 in French. And she, for the life of her, could not remember the word. She knew it was a construction, but she just couldn't catch it. And so the student who was running the experiment said, well, do you want me just to tell you? No, 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 she said, let me get this. And so she went a full minute struggling to try to remember. Eventually, she didn't. She gave up. She said, you're going to tell me this after the experiment's over. But she struggled in a way that no other student did in this particular study, or probably would have. But what was it about her? Was she exceptionally stubborn, frustrated? Like, what was going on at that moment where she would not give up? She knew it, but it wasn't coming from vocabulary retrieval. So she ran into a wall. So in this case, her willingness went up, and then it crashed very quickly when she couldn't remember the one word she needed. And in her interview, she said she knows her numbers, but after 7, she couldn't think about 80 or 90, and her willingness to communicate crashed back down, crashed into that wall, metaphorically. So what we've observed from our willingness studies is that it fluctuates a lot. Those graphs tend to show a lot of variability, much more than I expected. There's a statistical procedure you can do called change point analysis that would take all of the measurements for an individual, calculate a measure of standard error out of those, and then look for points where the change was bigger than the error would predict. Kind of similar to what a comparison of means versus standard deviation would do in a t-test. So anyway, with our willingness graphs, there's so much change. It's just every moment is a new change point. So with these particular tasks, it creates so much dynamics, it's almost impossible to say, well, there was a change here and it stabilized, because it changes so quickly again. We did find willingness was closely linked to anxiety and competence, especially in the interviews with students afterward. They often mixed anxiety, competence, vocabulary, experience, self-perceptions, meta-life. I mean, they mixed everything. Right? We can create nice definitions of our concepts and separate them. We can separate communication apprehension from communication anxiety. They've done this in the communication literature. Apprehension is more cognitive, anxiety is more experiential. But when you're interviewing someone about how they've just crashed into a wall, they're not separating them. They're integrated, they're interacting. And so that's what we're seeing in these studies. Learners tend to have a very clear metacognitive understanding of their competence. I should know this. And when you think about what I should know this means, it's really interesting from a communication point of view. For some, a drop in their vocabulary retrieval led them to abandon the topic. For others, they showed extra determination. How do you predict who's going to be determined, who's going to be quitting? Right? This is an interesting idea. So we came up with something that we call the 4 horsemen. Willingness, anxiety, perceived competence, and motivation. And the idea here is like, do you know the RCMP musical ride? And all those different horses are all doing their own thing, and all of a sudden they form these patterns, and then the patterns are in motion, and then they dissolve that pattern, they form a new one. And it's all beautiful and it all makes sense. It's very artistic. Well, as these patterns are forming, these are like the situations in the dynamic experience of the person. And then that will dissolve, and then those same horses, those same elements will form a new system, a new pattern that'll be interpretable as well. Maybe the first one was high willingness, low anxiety, high perceived competence. But it could also be high willingness, high anxiety, and high perceived competence because there's high motivation, like when you're doing a test. Okay? So what we're looking at here is not only the rules, but the exceptions to the rules as well. So we did a study with, we call it the motion of emotion. We're looking at anxiety here. And we did the ideodynamic method with 3 anxious and 3 low anxious students. And these were all pre-service teachers giving a lecture in Spanish before they went out to give a real class in Spanish. And what we found was that the high anxiety participants more often were trending toward anxiety. It was just building constantly, more so than the others. They spent many more seconds in the anxious zone. Their interviews were almost all negative. Like, I did this wrong, I was bad at that, I shouldn't have said this, I made a mistake here. They focused on the errors. And they tried to use a word-for-word memorization strategy, which I'm sure the teachers in the room would not recommend. The low anxious participants were the opposite. They were trending toward more relaxed emotions, They spent 1/3 less time in the anxious zone. They experienced anxiety, but a lot less. So it's not that there's no anxiety here, it's just less. They commented positively on their performance, so, oh yeah, I might have made a mistake there, but I did this well. And they prepared general ideas, but not memorized speeches. So, this is an example of, in this case we have the light line here is heart rate, and then the other is the idiodynamic anxiety ratings. So you can see here, this person's heart rate tended to go up as time went by, but their anxiety would go up and down and up and down and up and down. It fluctuated much more than their physiology did. There was one exception, and this is low anxiety person 2, whose heart rate was accelerated and who had relatively high idiodynamic ratings of anxiety. And then we asked her in the interview, like, what happened? She goes, are you kidding? You got me a heart rate monitor, you're putting me on camera recording what I'm saying, in front of a live audience with my teacher there, I'm being graded, and it's in my second language. Wouldn't that put you a bit on edge? And so, yeah, I guess so, thank you. So she's talking about how all these interacting parts of the experience fit together to give her an unusual anxiety reaction. Typically, she doesn't mind, but with the camera added and the heart rate monitor added, it was overwhelming. And so you can see her anxiety is bouncing all around. Her heart rate shows that she did have elevated arousal. So what happens if you study 2 emotions instead of just one? Carmen Boudreau, who's actually in medical school right now, her thesis was looking at enjoyment and anxiety in 2 tasks. One was to talk about a picture that they enjoyed, and the other is to talk about a happy event. And so we expected a pattern where ratings of anxiety would be high and enjoyment would be low, which is exactly what the correlations would lead you to predict in the literature. We also predicted high enjoyment and low anxiety. So, like a teeter-totter, a seesaw, right? One goes up, the other goes down. That's perfectly sensible. But we also saw patterns like high anxiety and high enjoyment. And this is, you might be familiar with Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, where you're testing your abilities. You're at the peak of your abilities. He called these peak experiences. So something is going, like you're curling. Remember that curling shot? Mm-hmm. It's like, this is the hardest shot I can attempt. So no doubt, some anxiety because of that. I think that was a Canadian championship. But what about the enjoyment that goes along with that? Anxiety arousal is high, and enjoyment is high. The literature doesn't predict that, but we can find these coherent moments in which it happens. Low anxiety, low enjoyment, we tended not to see that because you think of those as feelings of boredom, disengagement, disinterest. What was really interesting is we found these conflicting patterns within the same person. So here's the expected pattern, right? As anxiety is up, enjoyment is down. But look in this pattern here. There are moments when anxiety and enjoyment are both high. This is within the same person. So it's that these factors coalesce to create a state of mind that makes sense to the person, and then you can reform those same procedures, those same processes, to make a different pattern just a few seconds later. And it's all dealing with the flow of conversation. So as expected, we see high anxiety and high enjoyment, but we also unexpectedly saw high anxiety and high enjoyment. Okay, I'm just going to skip the narratives. They're just explaining what I said. This is a newer study we did on strategy training. The goal of strategy training is to keep conversation flowing. So why is it not studied in flowing conversations? Right? If you're looking at strategy training and strategy use over time, you don't see movies showing this. What you see is, checklists and ratings and pre-test, post-test kind of things. So we thought, well, can we use the idiodynamic process to teach nonverbal communication strategies? And with doing so, increase communicative competence. Okay, I'm just going to skip over the definitional issues and the argument that we need communication competence measures. But I want to point out something about the actor-observer effect. if you're the one communicating, you have access to certain knowledge. Right? For example, we have one person in one of our studies saying, yeah, I had spike in anxiety here because I'd forgotten a word, but then just as I needed it, it came to me. And so an observer would see a perfectly flowing speech. The person himself knew that he was about to stumble, but then caught himself and didn't. So he was feeling anxious, but nobody would have ever perceived why. The actor has access to information that the observers don't have. Conversely, sometimes actors will say things that don't make sense to observers. There was another study we did where a young man and young woman were paired up to speak to each other about a pre-chosen topic. In their case, it was television shows they enjoyed watching. And so this young guy comes in, he had a pencil in his ear, ball cap pulled down sideways. He sits down and goes, yeah, I only watch 4 things, basketball, this, that, and the other thing, puts his feet up on the chair. That's it, he's done. Not going to communicate anymore. He's finished. And so if you looked at her anxiety ratings, they went up. His anxiety ratings went down because he was done. He got his credit for being in the study. She's got to carry the conversation from here on. But in the interview, she said, yeah, I got anxious, but I don't know why. Well, he's being a jerk, that's why. He's not holding up his end of the conversation. So sometimes actors have access to information, sometimes observers can see things an actor can't see. So in this case, we had ideodynamic ratings of competence before and after strategy training. So I should tell you the communication goal here, these were all international students, and their job was to convince the person they were talking to come to their country for tourism. So they were going to talk about something in their country that would attract tourists. So we had about a dozen individuals go through this. Person number 10 showed a significant increase in both her ratings and her interlocutor ratings. P1, person number 1, showed significant increase in their own ratings, but the interlocutor didn't see anything better the second time around. Person 1 thought that she did better. The interlocutor said, no, it was about the same. So here's person number 10, the person who felt that she had improved. And what I'm highlighting here are ratings of above 0.2. So this is the ideodynamic software. This is her perceptual competence as she went through the study. So if you look at just the ratings above 2, there's very few in the pre-test, and a whole bunch in the post-test. She showed a significant increase in her perception of competence after strategy training. Now, I'd like to show you a video here, and I don't know if you can pause the Facebook part of this. I just didn't ask